Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Bill Bender, and we are going to be talking about the NFC North today. Very interesting division from my point of view, specifically because there are several quarterbacks. All four quarterbacks I would think are going to find spots on fantasy teams this year.
Yeah, this is maybe arguably the best division when it comes to quarterback play in terms of the whole picture. And you got to start with Aaron Rodgers. I know some people would want to start with Brett Favre, but we'll start with Aaron Rodgers, who is the top fantasy quarterback of the bunch. He's coming off two 4,000-yard seasons. He hits 30 touchdowns last season. And the guys and I have been looking at a YouTube video called Aaron Rodgers Rock and Roll by Eddie J. Lemberger. It's catchy. And he's caught on as a first-round pick, and I think he's worth it.
Now, would you say that he's solidified himself as the second quarterback taken in most drafts? Maybe even a totally optimistic person might take him first, or is he more along the third, fourth?
I think he's absolutely the second quarterback with an argument for first, and the reason why is because he's the rushing quarterback. He has 523 yards and 9 rushing touchdowns over the last 2 seasons, best in the league in both marks. So you get what you get from his legs. He's shown improvement, and they've looked scary in the preseason. I hate to be the optimistic person, but watching that Colts preseason game, their offense looks unstoppable, and that's going to have to be because their defense has struggled a little bit.
Now, while there's consensus on Rodgers, there's somebody else on the Packers who I found is fairly polarizing, and that's Jermichael Finley. Where do you see him as far as where he is among the tight ends? Because I've seen people say, he's probably most likely going to be around the 7th or 8th best tight end, and others are very optimistic that he'll be the best tight end, even above Antonio Gates and those guys at the end of the season.
Well, he's kind of like Gates, as the former basketball player with a big body and really unstoppable when you look at him across the middle. But I still wouldn't put him in Antonio Gates, Dallas Clark, even Jason Witten's class just yet because the Packers have so many weapons. I mean, Greg Jennings is going to have big games. Donald Driver isn't done yet, contrary to popular belief. And like I said, Aaron Rodgers is going to spread it around. And while he likes Finley, I think best case scenario, he gets around 800, 900 yards, and he has to stay healthy. So owners who make that, you're going to have to reach to get him, but just temper your expectations when you do.
As far as staying healthy, that's going to be the key, I think, for the Minnesota Vikings key players. Adrian Peterson's injury history hasn't really borne its ugly head, so to speak. He's not really much of a problem. But Brett Favre, Percy Harvin, there are other impact players. I would be worried about them.
Well, it starts with Sidney Rice losing him for half the season
I didn't even get to him.
Yeah, and Percy Harvin, who's had headaches, which the obvious joke is he gives fantasy owner headaches too, which he has. And Brett Favre's ankle has to hold up. And I'm going to tell you the stretch that's going to matter the most for the Vikings. We're going to find out what they're all about in weeks 5 through 8 when they go face the Jets on the road. Then they got Dallas. Then they go to Green Bay and New England. If the Vikings tank in that stretch, I'm wondering where Brett Favre's head will be in the second half of the season.
I mean, and the worst part is for Vikings fans and fantasy owners of Brett Favre is that he's not going to take himself out of a game. He's not going to stip one at this point, and nobody's going to have the guts to tell him that he can't play in a given game. So he's going to play hurt if he is hurt.
Well, fantasy owners, you're getting 16 games with Brett Favre, and he's still, because of the ankle, he's fallen in that 9, 10, 11 quarterback range where I've seen him fall maybe to the 15th quarterback taken. But, look at his Metrodome line, 21 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. If he can be good, and they do still have Peterson, who is, for my money, maybe the best back in the league, you can argue Chris Johnson, you can argue Adrian Peterson. You can't lose either way.
If the Vikings are a team where a lot of fantasy owners are going to be thinking, okay, be wary of a drop-off from last year's great season, the upside candidate's probably the Chicago Bears coming back. They've got Mike Martz now running the offense, which is the sort of thing that fantasy owners salivate over. And then they've also got all that talent just sitting there simmering, it seems. I think Matt Forte is a great bounce-back candidate, for instance.
I totally agree, and I think he gets off to a good start in Week 1 against the Lions. 3 of his 5 100-yard games have come against Detroit, so if you have Forte, get him in there this week for sure. And you talked about Mike Martz. He's maybe the most important coordinator ever in fantasy football because every fantasy owner knows who he is. And with Jay Cutler is the key to this team in what is a make-or-break year. If you watch them in the preseason, though, Cutler wasn't good. 19 of 37, and he was sacked 10 times. So if Martz's offense is going to work and all those receivers that owners are loving are going to be big, then Cutler must be protected.
I mean, we know that Martz loves to send out just their 5 guys, and the quarterback just has to know he's going to get hit. I mean, that's what we saw with Kurt Warner over all those years, getting worn down into the March system, even though he was an alien throwing 40 touchdown passes and everything. Who among the wide receivers would you target?
I think Johnny Knox is the golden boy for owners right now, and with good reason. He's got good speed. He fits that. Owners see him as maybe that Torrey Holt, that big playmaker that Martz had in St. Louis. But again, Martz's offense wasn't that good in Detroit, wasn't that good in San Francisco. And if Jay Cutler and that offensive line don't improve, they're not going to be that good this season with the schedule they have to face, because everybody in the NFC North has to play the NFC East and AFC East this season. So you're going to have to bring it every week, and we'll find out right away with Cutler if he's going to be able to hold up.
You mentioned Detroit, one of Mike Martz's former homes. They've got a very intriguing set of upside candidates, I would say. Calvin Johnson, the wide receiver, is going to be a starter in just about every league. But then we're also looking at Javid Best as maybe a running back who gets a little bit of running back 2 love in a lot of leagues, but for my mind, seems like a running back 3 option. And then Matt Stafford coming in, going to be playing from the beginning, starting. Where do you see that team going and those impact players?
Well, they're a hot pick as a sleeper in the NFC North, but they're just not as good as the other teams yet. I think in a year or two, though, the Lions will be back, which their fans do deserve it. Fantasy owners start with Calvin Johnson. He's a second-round pick. He's one of my favorite fantasy players. I'm just eternally fascinated with him. I draft him all the time, and I think he can be good as long as Matthew Stafford stays healthy, because 5 of Johnson's touchdowns came from Stafford last season. But again, Stafford, in the first early season, they go to Green Bay, they go to Minnesota, they go to Chicago, and Philadelphia in between.
Schedule.
So he's going to have a lot. We're going to find out if he can stay healthy right away.
So, I mean, you really shouldn't be drafting him as a starting quarterback.
I wouldn't count on him as a starter, but if he survives that early stretch, stays healthy, remember injuries were a problem last season, he'll be fine in the second half and continue to grow, because I like his upside moving forward. And as for Javid Best, again, there's a guy they're starting to compare him to Barry Sanders, which you can just stop now because it's not close. Please. But he could be a good, 10-touch flex-type play that can break that big play for your team because he's got that breakaway speed. Specifically
about the Lions, and this especially counts for PPR leads, what do you think of the theory that Eric Ferrer, one of the other members of the Sporting News Experts League, likes to talk about, is that these teams that are not very good, that are looking at winning 5 games tops during the season if they just play up to expectations, what do you think about the idea that they're going to be throwing the ball all the time when they're behind, and that maybe that does add a little bit to the wide receiver and quarterback values?
Well, they do, and you get the cosmetic yardage, we call it the cosmetic touchdowns. But you also get the cosmetic mistakes because when they're pressing, you look at Matthew Stafford, he threw 20 interceptions last season. So when you're pressing and down by 14, you're a bad team for a reason. So you got to be careful with that. You get that yardage, which is good for a guy like Calvin Johnson. But when you throw Stafford in there and then you get another interception in leagues that kill you with those, it can hurt.
So you wouldn't really call that a strategy?
Well, I would, because you're going to get the yardage, but you just got to make sure you don't have the mistakes. So but with those teams, with the Lions in particular, I would just stick with those 3 guys and really don't have to worry about too many else.
Bill, thanks for joining us for the podcast.
I appreciate it. Thank you, David.